Hello, welcome to our lecture on activity-based costing. Activity-based costing is part of our management accounts and it's a method for sharing out our overheads. So let's look in detail at what activity-based costing actually entails. So what does activity-based costing entail? Well, it entails linking our overhead costs to our drivers. So what we're going to see in activity-based costing is that there are lots of overheads generated by a business. So light, heat, energy costs, all of those will be part of our overhead costs, as opposed to our direct labour and direct materials. Those aren't overheads, those are direct costs of a product. We're thinking about other costs that are generated in that production. Now, thinking about those costs, thinking about electricity, energy costs, it's going to be difficult to actually allocate those overhead costs to a single product. And that's where activity-based costing comes in. It links those overhead costs to what is driving the costs. We then see how many drivers that the units of production actually take, and therefore we can allocate the overhead costs to the unit of production. So that's what we're seeking to do with activity-based costing. We need to link our overhead costs to what is driving the cost, and that's the key question. What is driving the cost? Why are we actually going to do this? Well, the main reason is if we think back to production lines in the past. So think of Henry Ford, the first production line there ever was. Henry Ford said you can have a car in any colour, okay, so any car in any colour, so long as it's black. So that was an indication of how simple the production line was. It was the very first production line, so it wasn't very complicated. It was simple. There was one car, one product, one colour, no choice. So it was very, very simple. In a simple production line like that, it is very easy to allocate the overhead costs because you simply say, right, well, all the products are the same. They've all been produced in the same way. So let's just get all the overhead costs and allocate them on something like the number of machine hours taken per product or the number of labour hours taken per product. And that was called absorption costing. So that was for very simple production lines. But now, these days, we have complex production. Think of a car production line now. You now can have any colour of car. You can have any engine that you want in the car. And you can have any specification that you want in the car. Not like in Henry Ford's time when you could have just one colour, one specification, one engine. So now we've gone from very simple production into very complex production. So we need to come up with a more complex method to allocate out the overhead costs, because it won't be just as straightforward as saying how many hours did it take to produce this product, because there's lots of other things that go into the product to actually make it. So we have complex production, we need a more complex way to allocate out those overhead costs, and that's what we're doing with our activity-based costing. Make sure that you remember that we're only talking about overhead costs. ABC, activity-based costing, allocates out the overheads in the business on the production line. Let's then see how we go about using this activity-based costing. And I want you to be clear because there are certain steps you need to go through, and it will be the same for every activity-based costing question. So basically, once you've learnt these steps, you know them and you apply them to every ABC question that comes along. So that's what you've got to do. You've got to learn the steps and then learn how to apply them and do that for every question that comes up on this area. The first step is to identify your cost drivers. This is very simple, really. What we ask ourselves is, what is causing the cost? So what element do we have in the production that is causing the cost? Really, there's no solution to this other than using common sense. So for example, if we had setup costs, well, what is causing that cost? Well, that's pretty straightforward. The number of setups would most likely cause that cost. What about ordering costs? Well, again, pretty simple. The number of orders would probably say the thing that is driving that cost or causing that cost. Dispatch costs, again, the number of dispatches is going to tell us how much that's going to be, i.e. the number of dispatches is causing the dispatch costs. So let's just make sure we can pick that out of a typical question. So looking at illustration 1 in your workbook, have a read at the illustration and then work through it with me. Illustration 1 is very straightforward. All we're asked to do is to identify our costs and our cost drivers. So we're going to set this out as the category and the driver. It's common sense, but just make sure that you identify the right driver, because that will feed down into the calculations that you'll do further on in the questions. So the first cost category that we have is setup costs. Well, let's identify the driver. Pretty straightforward. It's going to be the number of setups. Second category, material handling costs. Again, fairly simple to identify the driver. Material movements will be the cost driver behind that. The next category is inspection costs, and the driver behind inspection costs will be the number of inspections. So the solution to this one is to use common sense. Read through the question and make sure that you identify the correct driver for the category of cost that you're looking at. So we can see that step 1 is pretty straightforward in our activity-based costing. Let's look at step 2. Step 2 is to calculate our cost per driver. How do we do that? Well, again, fairly straightforward. We need to do two things. The first of those things is we pool the cost by category. So we get our total overheads. So you can always check whether you've done your pools correctly, because all of the pools should add up to your total overhead cost. So we pool the costs by category. For example, we pool our setup costs and get the total setup costs. We pool the inspection costs and get the total inspection costs. We add up those costs just to make sure that it adds up to our total overheads. And then we divide by the number of drivers. When we divide by the number of drivers, that will get us our cost per driver. So the number of drivers will be the number of setups, the number of inspections. So for example, the first step is to pool the costs. We'll look at the setup costs and the inspection costs and get a total for each. And then to calculate the cost per driver, we'll take our setup costs, our total setup costs, and divide by the total number of setups. That will get us the cost per setup. For inspection costs, we'll take the total inspection costs and divide by the total number of inspections. And that will get us the cost per inspection. So let's do that for our illustration. So look at illustration 2, read through the details, and then maybe have a go, or simply work through it with me. Illustration 2 asks us to calculate our cost per driver. So as we said in the lecture, we have two steps. The first step is to pool the costs. Do not forget this step. It's very, very important. You always need to pool the costs by category in an ABC costing question. So pooling the cost, we're going to have different categories of cost. We're going to have a working to work out what it is we need in the cost pool, and that will give us our cost pool. So the first of these are setup costs. Well, we're told that we have 100,000 of total overheads and 50% of them relate to setup costs. So 100,000 times 50% gives us a cost pool for setup costs of 50,000. The next category is our inspection costs. Again, we have 100,000 total overheads. 50% of them relate to inspection costs. So again, we're going to have 50,000. Now, whenever you get a bit of a more complex question than this, you might have made a little mistake in there. So just check that you've got your total overheads in your pools. So add up your cost pools to check that they add up to your total overheads, which in this case were 100,000. And we can see there that that is correct. So let's move on to step 2 in calculating our cost per driver. Step 2 in calculating our cost per driver is to take each category and divide our cost pool by the total number of drivers. So looking at setup costs first of all. Well, the total number of setups is 100. So we're told that we have a total of 100 setups. Our cost pool that we calculated in step 1 was 50,000. So to get our cost per driver, we take the cost pool divided by the number of drivers of 100. So our cost per setup is going to be 500. Let's do the same for inspection costs. Total number of inspections are 50. Again, our cost pool is 50,000. So our working is going to be 50,000 divided by 50, giving us a cost per driver of 1,000. So that is step 2 in our ABC, calculating the cost per driver. Once we have our costs per driver, we can take those costs per driver and calculate a cost per unit. So what we will do is say to ourselves, well, how many drivers are there per unit? So per unit of production, remember that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to allocate out the overheads per unit of production. So we're going to ask how many drivers there are in each unit that we're producing. So we'll need to do a table such as this one. So this is, remember, allocating out the overheads. So we'll take the setups, multiply the number of setups for a unit by the cost per setup, and that will get us our total cost. The inspections, the number of inspections times the cost per inspection will get us the total inspection costs. Adding those two up, the total inspection costs, the total setup costs, will get us our overheads per unit of A. Remember, this just allocates out the overheads. So to get the total cost of a unit of A, we'll need to add in our materials costs and our labour costs. But the ABC will allocate out the overheads and get us our overhead cost per unit. So let's look at illustration 3. Again, you might want to have a go at this before working through it with me, but look at it now. Illustration 3 introduces us to the last step in our activity-based costing process. We need to allocate out the costs per unit of production. So we're going to take each driver, we're going to see how many of those drivers it takes for a unit of production. We're going to multiply that by the cost per driver to get our total cost per unit. So for the number of setups, we have 20. So it needs 20 setups for each unit of production of A. The cost per driver is 500, so 20 times 500 gives us 10,000 for our setups. So 10,000 allocated to unit of A. Inspections, well, we need 2 inspections per unit of A. The cost per inspection is 1,000, so the total cost is 2,000. So that means that we can allocate total overheads per unit of A of 12,000. Remember, that is just the overheads. To get the total cost of a unit of A, we'd need to add in our materials cost, our labour cost, etc. But ABC is used to allocate the overheads that a unit of A has used. We can see from that the calculations on activity-based costing, if you follow the steps, are not very complicated. All of the questions will be similar and all of them will follow those steps, so you must be able to do them. So go back over that and make sure that you can. Mostly we will find that in the exam, the activity-based costing will be compared to absorption costing. Remember, we said that we're trying to allocate out the overhead cost per unit. Well, the simple way to do that is using absorption costing that you'll have met in previous studies. We are making that a little bit more complicated because we've got a complex production line. So we need ABC to share out those costs. Let's see why that might be the case, or why this might be a good idea. Well, there are some problems with absorption costing. Remember, absorption costing simply takes all of the overheads and relates them to volume. So for example, it takes your total overheads and separates them out and shares them out on maybe the basis of machine hours or labour hours. So that's a very simplistic way to look at production. And as we said, that's okay for a production line like Henry Ford's, where you've got a very simple product, only one product, and a very simple production line. But once you start to get a more complex production line, that can start to cause problems. So some of the problems will be that it's outdated. It's really related to that narrow production line that we talked about. Only one product really. The overheads also now in our complex production will make up a larger proportion of the total cost of a product. Think of a car production line in the 1930s and you'll think of lots of people standing making changes to the car, working on the car as it goes through the production line. Think of a car production line now and we think of machines. Those machines will take energy. That energy is an overhead. So overheads are now a big part of the total cost of production. So absorption costing really doesn't do as well whenever it comes to allocating out those overheads. Why will ABC be better? Well, absorption costing can lead to overproduction because if you produce more, well, that means that you can allocate out the same amount of overheads across more products. If you allocate out the same amount of overheads across more products, your cost per unit will fall. So management will think, I know a good way to get down my cost per unit. I'll produce more. I produce more units, I have the same amount of overheads, I can allocate that overhead out to the units, and my cost per unit will fall. Nowadays, we think of that as being a bad thing because if we have overproduction and that production isn't sold, it'll be held in inventory. That ties up cash and also is an inefficient use of the resources of the business. So absorption costing can lead to overproduction because we can get our cost per unit down by producing more, but that's a bad thing in modern terms. We want to produce as much as we can, but only as much as we can sell. Why should we use ABC then? Well, because it should lead to a better allocation, for example, of service costs. For example, canteen costs we can allocate out more easily. It uses many more drivers, so it looks at what's actually causing the cost. So it looks at many more drivers and links those costs to causes. So we should get a more accurate costing per unit. By looking at those costs also, we should get a better understanding of the costs. We should get better accuracy when it comes to maybe standard costing or getting our cost per unit. So we should get a better understanding of our overall costs and a more accurate cost per unit. So let's look at an example of this. Illustration 4 gives us an example where we do the cost per unit under absorption costing and the cost per unit under ABC costing so that we can see the differences. And this is an important question because this is often the way that it will be asked in the exam. So you need to understand this to do the exam standard questions. So look at illustration 4 now, have a read through it. If you want to have a go, have a go. If not, just work through it with me. In illustration 4, we are looking at the comparison between our activity-based costing and absorption costing. So looking at absorption costing first of all, well, the first thing that we will need is an absorption rate. So remember, absorption costing does it based on just one arbitrary calculation. So we look at the overheads, we take those overheads and divide them by, for example, the number of machine hours, and that gives us an absorption rate on which to absorb the overheads. So looking at this question, we have 100,000 of total overheads. The total machine hours are 50,000, so that gives us an absorption rate of 2. So the absorption rate used to absorb the overheads is going to be $2 per machine hour. So that's the absorption rate that we're going to use for our absorption costing part of the question. Now that we have our absorption rate, we can go straight to calculating our cost per unit using absorption costing. So the first thing we'll need to do is allocate out our overhead. So we'll take the number of machine hours times our absorption rate of 2. So for A, we have 10 machine hours and we have absorption rate of 2, which gives us 20 of allocated overhead. For B, we have 10, which is our 5 machine hours per unit times $2, our absorption rate. We also, though, don't forget, have materials cost per unit of 30 and 50. And we have labour cost per unit of 20 and 16. So all of that gives us a total cost per unit for unit A of 70 and for unit B of 76. So make sure you're comfortable with how you calculate the cost per unit under absorption costing. We now need to go on to compare that to calculating it under ABC costing. Remember, the first step in our ABC costing is to pool our costs. So we'll put this all in a table to calculate our cost per driver. But the first step is to pool our costs once we've chosen our drivers. So looking at the cost categories, we have setup costs with a total cost pool of 35,000, 35%. We have inspection costs of a cost pool of 45,000. And we have materials handling with a cost pool of 20,000. Always at this stage, just check that you've got your total overheads in there. The total overheads are 100,000 and just make sure that they're all in there. So we can now calculate our cost per driver. We're told that we have total number of setup costs of 350. Total number of inspections will be 750. So that gives us a cost per driver of 60. And total materials handling 1,000, giving us a cost per driver of 20. So 350 setup costs will give us a total cost per driver of 100. So that's 35,000 divided by 350. Inspection costs, we've 750 inspections, cost pool of 45,000. 45,000 divided by 750 gives us 60. And materials handling, we've a cost pool of 20,000. Total number of handling of the items is 1,000. And that gives us a cost per driver of 20. We can now use our cost per driver to calculate the total cost per unit of each product under ABC costing. So what we'll need to do is firstly allocate out the overheads and then add in the other costs. So we've got product A and product B. The first driver we're going to allocate out is our setup costs. So for product A, we have 300 setup costs. The cost per driver is 100. So that gives 30,000 of setup costs allocated to product A. For product B, we have 50 times 100 will give us 5,000 of total setup costs attributable to product B. For inspections, we have 500 inspections for product A, cost per driver of 60, which gives us 30,000. We have 250 inspections for product B, times 60, the cost per driver, will give us 15,000. Movements for product A, we have 300 times 20, which is the cost per driver, gives us 6,000. And 700 for product B times 20 again gives us 14,000. That means that the total overheads for product A are 66,000, for product B 34,000. Again, we can see that adds up to 100,000, our total overheads. So our total production is 2,500 of product A, 5,000 of product B, and that enables us to calculate the overheads. So the overheads per unit for product A will be the 66,000 divided by 2,500, 26.4. For product B will be the 34,000 divided by 5,000, which gives us 6.8. The materials cost per unit we're given in the question, it's 30 for product A and 50 for product B. The labour cost per unit for product A is 20, for product B is 16. So we can now calculate the total cost per unit for product A, which is 76.4, and the total cost per unit for product B, which is 72.8. So under ABC costing, those are the total costs for each unit of production. So looking at the information that has come out of our example, we can see that the absorption costing cost per unit for product A is $70. Now compare that to under ABC costing, where the cost per unit of product A has gone up to $76.4. Also looking at product B, under absorption costing, we had $76 per unit of a total cost, whereas under ABC costing, we have $72.8. It's clear to see that we now might have a shift in our focus in this business because we thought that product B was more costly. We thought that product A was cheaper, but actually under ABC costing, we can see that product A is actually more expensive to make than product B. So we're going to talk in a second about the implications of ABC costing. But it's clear to see from this example that it can give us much more detailed information. And once we've got that information, well, that might have a big effect on the business, because looking at this, we can see that our cost per unit has changed and changed quite dramatically. So let's go ahead and look at the implications of ABC costing. By now we should be fairly comfortable with the calculations on activity-based costing. The last bit of this session really deals with the implications of it, the theory bit, the bit that you need to be able to discuss for the exam. Remember, F5 is not just a calculations exam, so make sure that you can do the discussion. At least 50% of the marks on the paper will be for discussion of the things that you've calculated. So the implications for activity-based costing. Well, when it comes to pricing, well, if you have cost plus pricing, if you implicate or introduce activity-based costing, well, your price may change because your cost may change. So if you're using cost plus, where you're adding a little bit to your total cost, well, if you're adding a little bit to a different cost, you'll have to change your price. So changing to ABC may mean that your price may change. But in reality, remember that the market may set the price. You may want to charge a different price, but you may not be able to because the market will not let you and wouldn't buy at that price. So if you're suggesting this in the exam, make sure that you take note of whether the market sets the price or the company sets the price. For sales, well, your margin may change again because your cost may change. But you should have a better understanding of your margin because you'll understand in more detail where those costs are coming from. So you may be able to cut some of those costs, maybe even to increase your margin. So you may also, as we saw in the last question that we did, focus on different products, because you may now find that a product that you thought was more profitable than another one is no longer the case under ABC costing. So your focus may change from one product to another because you're now making more profit on that product. When it comes to performance management within the business, well, you'll get more detailed information out of the activity-based costing system. And we'll look at activity-based budgeting later, where we use that information to create our budget for next year. So allied to that, we'll get more accurate budgets. We also are enabled to focus on the cost drivers. So we can look at what's causing the cost and focus on those to maybe cut the costs. If we understand where the cost is, well, then we can understand how to reduce that cost. All in all, activity-based costing will lead to a better understanding of the costs within a product and within a business. That then will enable us to make better decisions. We should have accurate cost information, and that will enable us to project into the long run as to how the business can perform. It'll also provide us with lots of data for evaluation. So all of those will enable us to get more information and give us better chances of making profit. However, there are some problems with activity-based costing. First problem is it takes time to set it up, and that's going to cost money. So think about anything in accountancy. You're at the start of your ACCA qualification, so think about what you're going to have to say in the exam, and for anything in accountancy, it's going to take time and it's going to cost money. So if you're trying to think of a problem about anything in any of your exams, usually it's going to take time and cost money. Why is it going to cost money? Because the support systems are going to be required. We may need a new IT system, we may need a new accounting system. Both of those are going to cost money. You may also find with activity-based costing that too much information is produced. If you produce too much information, then the value of that information is degraded because we don't know what to do with it. I have heard of a lot of businesses who put in an activity-based costing system and then subsequently take it out again because no one understands the information coming out of it and there's too much information produced. So tied in with that, you may need an expert to actually understand the information that's coming out of the system. So you may require an expert. Again, that will cost money. Also remember that activity-based costing will not be suitable for all industries. It's not suitable for service industries. It is suitable for manufacturing industries, but the production needs to be relatively complex for ABC to work. Simple production of one product, like Henry Ford, will not be suitable for activity-based costing. We need complex production and several products. That was our session on activity-based costing. Make sure that you now go ahead and look at the test your knowledge questions in your workbook. Go through them, make sure that you can do them, and then have a go at the suggested past paper questions, because the key to passing any of these ACCA exams is practice, practice, practice. So go and do the past paper questions on activity-based costing and make sure that you're happy with this topic.